reasonable hope?
I think that is a reasonable hope, and I think that is something that, you know, the condemnations today came from, as I said, Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi, from Iranian President Mohammad Khatami. It was Saddam Hussein, the odd man out, who said that the United States deserved this, but early indications are that the more moderate Arab states, which of course have always been more friendly to the United States, supportive of the United States, are condemning the attack. Remains the United States, but I think it's absolutely correct that there's going to have to be worldwide assistance in trying to determine who did this and then deal with the retaliation.
Well, that's the point of my question. To issue a condemnation is one thing, but when it comes to actions, for instance, if the United States were to strike against Osama bin Laden on Afghanistan's soil, that would be quite a very strong action, and it would put the moderate Arab nations in a difficult position.
Would certainly put them in a difficult position. There's no question about that. It would be, they'd have
firefighters to speak with us live when we have our hits for you. It is virtually impossible to know when they will be trickling out. However, much as I've done this evening, I have caught up with firefighters as they have passed our NBC News truck here and spoken with them. Notably, in the last hour, 2 groups, one from Hollis, Queens, another one again from Washington Heights, painting different stories. First of all, the Hollis, Queens firefighters, they were actually doing not search and rescue operations, but indeed firefighting. And you can hear now the noise of these trucks as they head on in down to Ground Zero to help remove the equipment, remove concrete slabs and metal and the like. The firefighters, I don't know if you can get a picture of this over my shoulder, but through that dim haze there, you might see a flickering orange light. We weren't certain earlier if that was a light of some sort assisting firefighters in recovery or if indeed it was a fire. Because of its flickering nature and because the Hollis Queens firefighters told me that they had been indeed battling fires themselves, we believe that to be a fire going on right now. So there are firefighters that are doing that which their job title describes. The firefighters from Washington Heights, they told me that what kept them going when I asked them this question, the only thing that kept them going was the thought they had been told, whether true or not, that sometime this afternoon, one company of firefighters, which consists of a leader, a driver, and 4 men, were found and pulled out alive. Now, there is no confirmation of this. When I went up to where the command post area is, there was no fire official that could confirm this. But if nothing else for us, it served to give them hope and inspiration to keep plugging away. Both of these groups I had spoken to had been on the job for 24 hours. They'd been on fighting other fires or assisting with problems in their own districts and then were pulled into here. They were exhausted, to say the least. They had these haunted looks about them. Yet, they said what kept them going was the possibility of hope of finding someone alive. Now, speaking of exhaustion, I've been, just for comparison's sake, up 22 hours now. 6 a.m. yesterday morning began what I thought would be a normal day. I'm having trouble hanging on to this microphone at times. I feel twitches, and it's not from the cold. The weather's been very cooperative and probably assisting the firefighters. It's not too cold, which would allow them not to have much muscle cramping. From the cold, at least. The fatigue is an entirely another matter. But my hands themselves, you know, I find them kind of twitching. That is nothing compared to the exhaustion and the muscle fatigue experienced by these firefighters out on the lines. I have seen several dump trucks come by me filled to the brim for us with concrete, metal, plaster. One came through with what looked like a huge door. In addition, there was a car that came by as I was standing there in the road that was covered in soot. I mean, I don't know how the driver drove that car. 3 inches of soot, and it was coming off in a stream behind the car as it went down the West Side Highway heading northbound out of the staging area. I started coughing just in a violent fit, and again, nothing compared to what the firefighters are dealing with down in that plume of smoke there that does not seem to dissipate at all, Forrest.
We have heard, of course, that Mayor Giuliani said he would like all civilians to stay far, far, far away from there. As you look around, has he succeeded?
Forrest, once again, I wasn't clear on that.
Civilians, ordinary people, Mayor Giuliani has asked that they not come anywhere near there. As you look around, they are not there?
there were more people here when I got in, 5-6 hours ago into the area. You know, residents, locals that were coming down, some with cameras, some just standing agape. Virtually all of them covered in soot from walking in the area. I can tell you my bottom of my pants, shoes, gone. But now it has calmed down until all this activity that we see coming down here southbound on the West Side Highway coming in. Until this, it was really quiet the last couple of hours in particular. So by perhaps 2 a.m. Eastern time, even the most curious onlookers seem to have headed home or for some sort of semblance in taking all of this in and trying to digest what's happened here in Lower Manhattan today. Now it may be picking up a little bit. I'm seeing the activity of the trucks. Still no people, sightseers, onlookers trying to get a glimpse of things, in part because it's so dark, Forrest. In addition, you're not able to see ground zero unless you go down to the command post, and even we, the media, are being kept away from that command post as best they can. I know that my producer was able to get a portable camera down with him, sort of a spy cam, if you will, and did take some pictures that we fed into you a couple of hours ago that shows the voluminous amounts of debris, 5, 6, 7 stories high, though I'm not certain if the pictures you saw represented that. We do know that there are huge concrete slabs, metal pilings, shards of glass, plaster dumped up to 5, 6, 7 stories high on the south side of the buildings here, Forrest.
Alex Witt, thank you very much, Alex. If you are a New Yorker, I would urge you to follow Mayor Giuliani's counsel and not go down there. You might want to see it, but it is not something that you need to be there for, and it will only impede their work, and their work is absolutely important. Nora O'Donnell is at the Pentagon right now. She's been following the work that is going on there and the security that has been installed all around Washington, D.C. Nora?
Forrest, it has now been 18.5 hours since a Boeing 757 plunged into the southwest side of the Pentagon. Officials say that that jet was probably traveling at about 600 miles an hour and had 6,000 gallons of fuel in it. It tore a gaping hole in the Pentagon. Now, 18.5 hours later, a fire is still burning inside the Pentagon. Fire officials working to put out that fire. They are hoping to have most of that fire put out by dawn so that they can then move in the recovery team, the search and rescue team inside the Pentagon to begin lifting some of that debris. Officials now estimating that there could be some 800 dead inside the Pentagon. That includes the 64 members who were on American Airlines Flight 77 from Dulles Airport towards San Francisco. So there has been a large loss of life here at the Pentagon. Officials saying that what normally happens in a situation like this, that there is a casualty assistance team. What's going on is that all of the military military team is going and looking for who is accounted for. Once they discover that someone is missing and that person has perished, they will then make the decision to go out to people's homes in teams. This is the military tradition, to go inform family members what has happened to their loved ones. An official I spoke with here at the Pentagon just about 2 hours ago said he's not sure yet whether that process has begun yet, but that is the tradition and that they are certainly working towards that as each of the units of the armed forces work through to discover who is missing, as there is one whole side of the Pentagon that essentially has been destroyed tonight, and that area is still hot, still smoldering, still leaving billowing smoke through most of Washington. Most of Washington under heavy and tight security today. Officials estimating that there are some 1,500 to 2,000 National Guard on the ground, that number could rise by the morning. Anecdotally, on the streets of Washington, there are about every other block Humvees, camouflaged Humvees with armed guards standing, watching, waiting, making sure that there is no suspicious activity. So this city is being watched very closely. Around the world, the United States has issued ThreatCon Delta, U.S. military forces on a state of the highest alert. The Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, today, in his office when this plane collided in with the Pentagon at about 9:40 a.m. Eastern Time. The plane collided on the southwest side of the building. The Secretary of Defense's office is on the opposite side of the Pentagon, and yet he felt the shaking. He then, we're told by sources, got up from his desk, went to the other side of the Pentagon, and was actually helping some of the casualty victims. The Secretary of Defense then deciding to hold a briefing inside the Pentagon later in the afternoon to make the very point that it is not, business as usual has not been disrupted at the Pentagon. In fact, he is asking for people to return to work at the Pentagon tomorrow. There's no talk yet of retaliation here. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff saying they're not ready to discuss what the next step is, but the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Henry Shelton, saying, quote, make no mistake about it, our armed forces are ready. Forrest.
Nora O'Donnell at the Pentagon, where, of course, all that she has described has happened. Thank you so much, Nora. And all around the Capitol building, all around the White House, all around Washington, D.C., the kind of security that Nora describes is in place. Meanwhile, the administration wants to find out who did it and wants to do something about it. President Bush has pledged to the nation, this from the Oval Office at 8:30 this evening, Eastern Time, to find those responsible and bring them to justice. In the meantime, a senior administration official who sought anonymity cited, and I quote, strong information implicating Osama bin Laden, that exiled Saudi who it is believed has been hiding in the hills, moving from place to place in Afghanistan, under the protection, it is fair to say, of the Taliban, the group that controls Afghanistan now. And this official says that President Bush is considering a wide range of military options targeting Osama bin Laden. Now, one thing that he said in his speech is absolutely critical to remember. He said, we will make no distinction between the terrorists who committed these acts and those who harbor them. By that he means those who states that give them protection, that give them safe harbor, and keep them from the people who would seek retaliation, such as the United States. And therefore, if he does decide that Osama bin Laden is in fact behind these, there is evidence to support it, and ample evidence, then Afghanistan would be held responsible as well. And that means that the stakes in this push-pull of game of terrorism will have been raised dramatically. Now, at the center of all this, of course, is Israel and the state of Israel and the questions surrounding the state of Israel and the struggle between Israel and the Palestinians. Donna Friesen is with us now from Israel with the latest on the response there. Donna?
This is a place that is accustomed to almost daily terror attacks and to intense security. But the magnitude of what we saw in the U.S. on Tuesday has totally stunned people here. Many leaders from the region have condemned the attacks. Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak, Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi, not considered a friend of the United States, offered his condolences, calling the attack horrifying. So did Iranian President Mohammad Khatami, offering his deep sympathy to the United States. Iraq's Saddam Hussein, however, perhaps not surprisingly, has said the United States deserved it because of, in his words, its crimes against humanity. There is a great deal of anti-American sentiment in this part of the world, some of it expressed within hours of the attack.
In East Jerusalem, a small group of Palestinians celebrate the carnage in the United States, a legitimate target for terrorists, they believe, because of its support for Israel.
They are helping the Jews to kill the Palestinian people.
God is great, they yell, and hand out sweets until police disperse them. From the Palestinian leadership, though, unequivocal condemnation and condolences for the victims.
We are completely shocked, completely shocked.
But with each Israeli attack on Palestinian targets, anger in the Arab world grows. Israel's Apache helicopters, American-made. Its missiles, American-made. Many believe without the U.S., Israel would not exist. Anger, too, about almost daily bombings of Iraq by U.S. warplanes. And the continued presence of U.S. troops in Saudi Arabia, Osama bin Laden's homeland. Bin Laden, now prime suspect in the attacks, has called on his followers to fight until all Americans are driven out of Islamic countries. There's long been fear the conflict in Israel could drag neighboring Arab countries into a wider war. Now this attack may further embolden enemies of Israel.
The ambitions of terrorist groups that fight against Israel will rise.
The leader of Hamas, the Islamic extremist group responsible for many suicide bombings inside Israel, says he doesn't support attacks against innocent people, but says the U.S. must reassess its position. It's the cause of injustice in many parts of the world, he says. Tonight, Israel's prime minister calling for an international war on terrorism.
I believe that together we can defeat these forces of evil.
At the American embassy in Tel Aviv, flowers of sympathy.
I think very few Americans now don't understand how Israelis feel.
Israel's airspace closed to all flights except El Al, the national airline, which has incredibly tight security, including undercover armed security people in its airplanes. The border with Jordan and Egypt is closed, as are all the checkpoints in and out of the West Bank and Gaza, effectively a lockdown underway in this country. Police reinforcements have been sent to the American embassy in Tel Aviv and the consulates in Jerusalem. Several U.S. embassies in the Middle East have been closed indefinitely, in Yemen, in Kuwait, in Oman, and the United Arab Emirates. And Israel has declared Wednesday, today, a day of mourning in solidarity with the United States, and also has sent rescue teams, experts in extricating people from rubble of buildings, to help out in New York to assist in the search and recovery efforts. Forrest?
Donna, Richard Holbrooke, the former United Nations ambassador, said today that if there is going to be a credible attack on terrorism, the United States must have international support, and that must include the moderate Arab states. Is that a reasonable hope?
I think that is a reasonable hope, and I think that is something that, the condemnations today came from, as I said, Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi, from Iranian President Mohammad Khatami. It was Saddam Hussein, the odd man out, who said that the United States deserved this, but early indications are that the more moderate Arab states, which of course have always been more friendly to the United States, supportive of the United States, are condemning the attack. Remains to be seen how much support there will be in trying to assist the United States, but I think it's absolutely correct that there's going to have to be worldwide assistance in trying to determine who did this and then deal with the retaliation.
Well, that's the point of my question. To issue a condemnation is one thing, but when it comes to actions, for instance, if the United States were to strike against Osama bin Laden on Afghanistan's soil, that would be quite a very strong action, and it would put the moderate Arab nations in a difficult position.
It would certainly put them in a difficult position. There's no question about that. It would be, they'd have to be forced to cross a line, perhaps, in their own minds and decide who they're going to support, similar to what they had to do in the Gulf War. So yes, I think there would be a lot of tough decisions that would have to be made if, in the event Osama bin Laden is in fact responsible for this, and retaliation is likely against Afghanistan and the Taliban.
Now, this is off the mark in terms of the controversy between Israel and the Palestinians. Do you expect that the events that have happened yesterday will have any impact on that at all?
It's hard to say. I mean, last night, curiously, there was all this security lockdown. The checkpoints between in and out of the West Bank and Gaza were shut down, so there's very little movement of Palestinians into Israel and throughout the West Bank. But at the same time, Israeli tanks that had been converging on the West Bank city of Jenin, they got there 2 nights ago. They were sitting there. Last night, after midnight, when everybody was focused on what was happening in the United States, the Israeli army moved into Jenin. There was quite a firefight there. There was tank fire. 1 Palestinian was killed. Several were injured. The Israelis were there for about 4 hours and then moved back out. So in many ways, the internal violence that's been going on here for almost a year now appears to be continuing. And, it's possible to say that Israel took advantage last night of all the focus of the attention on the United States and moved into Jenin while the eyes of the world weren't looking. It is important to say, though, that they did withdraw. They were there for about 4 hours and have withdrawn from within the city of Jenin. Israel considers Jenin to be a hotbed of terrorists and says that a number of the suicide bombers who have attacked Israeli targets in the past 11 months have come from Jenin.
Donna Friesen in Israel, thanks so much for talking to us, Donna. In London, today, yesterday really, police ordered journalists to evacuate Prime Minister Tony Blair's office for about 20 minutes. Actually, this was on Wednesday morning. Blair and other officials did remain inside the building. The security alert ended very early, about 8 o'clock Greenwich Mean Time. Kiko Itasaka is in London. where Tony Blair has denounced this in as strong terms as any international leader has. Kika?
Yes, of course, as you can imagine, the evacuation of Downing Street is a tremendous blow to the confidence and feelings of people in England. It is a situation throughout the world where buildings are being evacuated. Earlier today in Malaysia and in Frankfurt, apartment blocks where victims of a bomb scare turned out to be nothing. But it gives you a sense of how vulnerable everybody feels right now. We also just learned a few minutes ago that the Bank of America in London was also evacuated. Again, everybody, everywhere, feeling very vulnerable. It's not just America for us.
Kiko, as you know, I was just talking with Donna about the support in the moderate Arab world and in the Middle East for the United States taking a very strong action, likely a military action. As you assess European leaders, how do you see it?
Well, the European leaders have apparently been in contact with one another discussing possible plans, but until they get guidance from President Bush in the United States, they cannot act on their own, obviously. So we are waiting all throughout Europe for that word.
Is it true that Tony Blair and George Bush have not spoken yet?
To my knowledge, as of approximately 1 hour and a half ago, they had not spoken. But I have a feeling that Bush probably has a lot on his mind, and I think that the European leaders are really basically hoping that they will all get one message together, telling them what to do, what they can do in terms of gathering intelligence, whether or not they should participate in any military action should it take place.
Kiko Itasaka in London. Thanks very much, Kiko. And, of course, there you see the very heart of it. If there is going to be a strong attack on terrorism, if there is going to be a war on terrorism, remember so many people have called this the second Pearl Harbor, have called this an act of war, then most certainly it will have to be led by the United States. And that means that the United States is going to have to organize the international support in the same way that George Bush's father did in the Gulf War. They were so very effective in gathering the moderate Arab states, in fact, persuading the Saudi Arabians to allow the United States to stage out of there, that they were able to drive back Saddam Hussein from Kuwait. It will require something of that kind of delicate diplomacy on this front as well. And so George W. Bush is hearkening back to his father's administration, both in terms of this and in terms of struggling with the economy, which is what his father had to deal with also. Might mention that there is a government probe focusing on Osama bin Laden now. They appear to be piecing together a case that links him to this, the worst terrorist attack in U.S. history. In part, there has been an intercept of communications between Osama's supporters and some cell phone calls from victims aboard the jetliners before they crashed on Wednesday. Not entirely clear what those links might be, but authorities are saying that they are there, and they are therefore focusing on possible Osama supporters in Florida based on the identification of a suspected hijacker on one of the manifests of the 4 jets that crashed. So they have crime scenes in Florida now. That's Broward County in South Florida, Daytona Beach on the eastern coast in Central Florida. They have crime scenes in Boston, in Newark, in New York. They are pouring through it all. Right now we have a report from Ann Thompson. Let us hear from that.
A direct hit that shattered New York City's confidence.
Well, as soon as the first building collapsed, everybody made a mad dash to just take cover.
And everybody just started running. I just happened to duck right into the fourth building.
As soon as we got out of the train station, people were screaming and crying and yelling, and it was just total chaos. And the bottom of our building was blown out.
For me, Ground Zero, Fulton and Broadway, about 2 blocks from the World Trade Center, just as the South Tower crumbled.
Hollywood could never imagine something like this. A tidal wave of smoke and debris came roaring down Broadway. I was standing at the corner of Fulton and Broadway. I ran into a building, ran between a column and a building at 195 Broadway, and pushed my face and my body into that building. For what seemed like 5 minutes, I was pelted with all kinds of debris. I crouched down, was coughing, trying to breathe. You couldn't get any air. The air was so full of smoke and dust. When it finally settled, I stood up. My glasses were covered with dust. Hours later, I'm still covered with dust. The building that I was in front of, 195 Broadway, the doors were gated shut. They opened the doors, let us in, and inside we were finally able to breathe. It wasn't easy. My eyes were filled with dust. My mouth was filled with dust. I was choking. The people I was with were choking. It was just absolutely horrific. All I could think of was, this is war.
I just heard the rumble, and then I ran like hell, and there was a large wind coming.
Down here, panic. Survivors flee by whatever means they can, fearing more destruction at any moment.
At 10:30, I tried to leave the building, but as soon as I got outside, I heard a second explosion and another rumble and more smoke and more dust. I ran inside the buildings, the chandeliers shook, and again, black smoke filled the air. Within another 5 minutes, we were covered again with more silt and more dust. And then a fire marshal came in and said we had to leave because if there was a third explosion, this building might not last.
Everyone, please clear the corner.
Palpable fear as people run through the streets, choking on dust and debris.
You gotta chase it. Come on, let's go, let's go.
We saw the building come down. We all ran, and the walkway held up to save like 40 or 50 of us that were right there. We were buried there, and then cops shot out windows in the next building. It was the only thing that was in front of us was like these 1-inch windows.
The streets of the financial district covered with debris, in some cases ankle deep. Cars on fire, cars just turned by the force of the explosion. It was like something no one had ever seen.
Good morning, I'm Jill Becker.
And I'm Ken Watts. Welcome to this special edition of 11 Alive News Today. You're probably waking up this morning still in disbelief about the devastation in New York City and the nation's capital yesterday. First with attacks on both World Trade Center towers, then the plane crash into the Pentagon, followed by the crash in Pennsylvania.
All reportedly the work of terrorist hijackers. This is what the World Trade Center looked like overnight as crews moved through the debris searching for survivors and bodies from the attack. It's unclear just how many people have died, but the number is believed to be in the thousands. Crews in Washington are searching through the debris at the Pentagon as well. Casualties are estimated about 800, according to some reports. And this is this morning's Atlanta Journal-Constitution. As you can see, outrage and the picture of the World Trade Center, what's not left of the World Trade Center. But, you know, Ken and I were talking earlier, in this age,
doesn't really capture it.
When so many of us were watching television as that second plane hit the second tower at the World Trade Center.
It's just impossible for a still photo to capture all that. You know,
it truly is.
Incredible devastation, and there's a great deal of grief, but also a great deal of anger, captured by that headline.
With outrage. I think that after the stunning part of yesterday and then the sadness that so many people are still experiencing, and then comes the outrage.
Yeah, we heard one State Department official yesterday call it possibly the worst single-day fatality rate in American history, more than the Battle of Antietam, more than the Battle of Gettysburg in the Civil War. So.
Well, and what we're hearing right now is in the neighborhood of 10,000 casualties. Of course, we won't know for sure for many, many days, weeks, months, perhaps. So.
Well, the images of horror will not soon fade from the minds of millions of Americans who watched this tragedy unfold on national TV. And this morning, new pictures show the first plane slamming into the World Trade Tower. A camera crew was in the area working on a project when they noticed the plane fly overhead. The jetliner crashed into the building, beginning a series of events that changed America and the world forever. NBC reporter David Bloom walks us through the new day of infamy.
The first attack plane, a hijacked American Airlines flight out of Boston, slams into the North Tower of New York's World Trade Center at approximately 8:42 a.m. Eastern Time. The explosions and fireballs broadcast live by television helicopters, which then, horrifically, spots the second attack plane, a United Airlines flight hijacked from Boston, taking dead aim at the World Trade Center's South Tower. It's now approximately 9:03 a.m.
Hey, where the hell can I meet you? I'm across the street from the Marriott, man. A second airplane, a 727, just ran into the building.
Emergency officials estimate 20,000 or more people may have been inside the two 110-story buildings at the time of the attacks. Eyewitnesses report victims falling, and in some cases, jumping from the two buildings.
But there were people falling out of the sky.
At 9:29 a.m., President Bush in Florida addresses the nation for the first time.
Terrorism against our nation will not stand.
But in the nation's capital, just 11 minutes later, 9:40 a.m., a third hijacked plane, an American flight out of Washington Dulles, crashes into the Pentagon in a burst of flames. The plane's wreckage tearing a gaping hole into one side of the building. Federal buildings are evacuated. Government leaders taken to secure hideouts. 9:59 a.m. The until now unthinkable. The South Tower of the World Trade Center collapses. An unknown number of people still trapped inside, including the rescuers, firefighters, and police who'd gone in trying to save lives. Then at 10 a.m., hundreds of miles away in western Pennsylvania, a fourth hijacked plane, a United flight out of Newark, crashes 80 miles southeast of Pittsburgh. 1/2 hour later, 10:28 a.m., the North Tower of the World Trade Center collapses. Rubble, debris spreading for blocks. In all, 266 people aboard 4 hijacked planes are killed. Untold others in Washington and New York missing and presumed dead. In New York, a defiant Mayor Rudolph Giuliani.
The city of New York in the United States of America is much stronger than any group of barbaric terrorists.
For the first time in U.S. history, the Federal Aviation Administration closes all domestic airports, shutting down all U.S. airspace until at least noon tomorrow. The U.S. military and American embassies worldwide placed on the highest alert. Navy aircraft carriers and destroyers deployed along the eastern seaboard. The president, now in Louisiana, speaks for a second time.
The resolve of our great nation is being tested. But make no mistake, we will show the world that we will pass this test.
The president is then taken to the secure Strategic Air Command in Nebraska, meets with his national security team via teleconference before boarding Air Force One to return to Washington. But in New York late this afternoon, a third damaged building, the 40-story World Trade Center number 7, also crashes to the ground. And emergency officials allow the first camera crew from NBC News inside the smoking hulks of the Twin Towers. Ground zero, cars overturned, steel torn apart, glass shards, small fires still burning. The very picture America most feared, the image terrorists most wanted.
Unbelievable. Afghanistan's Taliban leaders who have been harboring terrorist Osama bin Laden for years deny that he is involved, but U.S. officials tell NBC News that since the attack, they have picked up new evidence making them 90% sure that he was the mastermind behind the terror. We'll have more on Osama bin Laden later in this newscast. Our team coverage continues now here in Atlanta with reaction to this national tragedy. Major high-rise buildings were closed yesterday. Federal and state workers went home, and many area malls and businesses shut their doors.
11 Live's Mike Stevens joins us live from a 24-hour gymnasium in Southwest Atlanta with more on how people are dealing with the attacks. Good morning, Mike.
Hey, good morning, guys. We're at Run and Shoot on Metropolitan Parkway down in Southwest Atlanta. People here are coming out this morning for their regular morning workout, but this is not a regular morning. This is the morning after the big tragedy. A lot of people are having a hard time dealing with it this morning. Everybody pretty much saying the same thing. They're shocked. They're outraged. Here's a gentleman. Sir, come on and talk with us real quick. You've been following the events of what's been going on. What's your reaction this morning?
Well, I feel it's a tragedy that affects us all, and maybe we can all come together and find a way to prevent this from happening again, and maybe try to really figure out who did it and bring them to justice.
Now, yesterday, when this thing all started, you had a certain feeling about it. How do you feel this morning?
Angry, I feel that we have to find ways to prevent this thing from happening again. It's not so much of a retaliation that we need to go for. We need to find ways of preventing it from happening again.
All right, so thank you. Appreciate you joining us this morning. Certainly a lot of people are talking about this morning, finding a way to prevent it from happening again. We talked to some other people this morning out in the street today. Here's what they had to say.
Retaliate. Most definitely. We have to send a message. They're sending a message that they have no respect for the United States. And we also have to send a message that if you do anything like that on our territory, that we also have to retaliate.
There's just a lot of cowards and just a lot of lawless people that hide behind their religion. And I just feel sorry for those who think that they're going to heaven with their acts that they've done, and they're gonna meet their real judgment when they get there.
Now, we mentioned that people are here for their regular workout. This is a big gymnasium where they play basketball, and there's a track that goes around it. There are also several workout rooms here, and in every one of the rooms, there are TVs on. People's eyes are glued to the sets trying to find out the latest information, and that's what we hope to present to you this morning as it comes in to us here at 11 Alive News. Guys, I'm going to send it back to you, and we'll check back with you a little bit later on this morning.
All right. Thank you, Mike. And shortly after the hijackings and attacks, the Federal Aviation Administration closed the nation's airports, and Atlanta's Hartsfield remains closed this morning.
11 Alive's Paul Crowley joins us live from Hartsfield, where stranded passengers were moved out of the airport and only essential personnel remain on duty. Paul?
Good morning, Ken and Jill. For the first time in its history, Hartsfield Airport sits empty. The only people here, and they are here in force, are police officers who have cordoned off the airport. It has been closed since 11 o'clock last night. It is now a virtual ghost town. Like airports around the country, thousands, perhaps 30,000 passengers were stranded at Hartsfield when America's airliners were grounded yesterday afternoon. No indication at this point exactly when they will be flying again. That's expected later today. As you can see, bomb-sniffing dogs were going through the airport. They were even doing sweeps last night to make sure that everything is secure here. Delta Airlines saying it will not fly until at least 6 o'clock tonight. No word from the FAA when the official restart is, but many of the passengers we talked to, while they were inconvenienced by all this, some were just glad to be alive.
I'm in shock. I'm blown away by it all. I feel like we went to war and nobody told us.
I got goosebumps thinking about it, you know. We just must pray for those who are mourning, and then ours is nothing in relation to what they're going through.
Back live at Hartsfield Airport, obviously many of those passengers understanding, not minding the inconvenience, the hardship. We talked to one man who missed his grandfather's funeral. People stranded here, not knowing anybody in Atlanta. Even private local Atlantans coming to the airport and offering their homes to these people. Certainly a sign of how Americans come together in this type of tragedy. Again, the FAA not announcing the exact time when airlines will start flying today. Delta saying it won't fly before 6 o'clock this evening. And we should learn more as the morning progresses. Live at Hartsfield Airport, Paul Crowley, 11 Live News Today.
All right, thank you, Paul. Tuesday's events remind us that no matter how good airport security systems seem in America, they are far from flawless. But aviation experts say not much more can be done beyond what's already in place, otherwise we'd make air commerce virtually useless.
If this is going to be done primarily with people, rather than with arms or bombs or things of that nature, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to prevent, and we may be left with the only option being to, as I say, put armed people on the airplane to have at least a chance of fighting back.
This discussion is sure to continue as Americans try to weigh the balance of living in a free society versus better security.
Of course, the attacks also put the U.S. military on high alert this morning. Navy ships departed from Norfolk, Virginia yesterday evening in support of defense and humanitarian efforts in New York City. Military installations here in Georgia are on standby as well. 11 Alive's Keith Whitney has more from Dobbins Air Reserve Base.
Tonight, Georgia military bases are on high alert. At Fort McPherson, the MP search every car entering the base, and the ones whose drivers are not on active duty are turned away. This is one of the nerve centers for U.S. military ops all over the world, and there will be no chance taking here, period.
And what we are doing as Forces Command is assessing the situation, taking the appropriate actions. You know, we're not going to can't get into specifics of the appropriate actions, but that's what every installation that we command is taking doing the assessment and taking the appropriate action.
It is a brutal irony that the lingering sunset over Dobbins Air Reserve Base is clear of any air traffic. Planes and choppers are grounded unless called into action by the Pentagon.
Right now, our national focus is on rescue and recovery, and additionally protecting our assets, which includes equipment and people.
Brigadier General William Kane has been a pilot most of his military career. When asked what the hijacked pilots may have been thinking as their jets were turned into bombs, he says it is a pilot's worst nightmare.
My goodness, the passengers and the crew, just such a horrible, horrible feeling for them. I'm sure my heart goes out to them. I'm sure yours does as well, let alone the folks on the ground. I mean, this is a national tragedy, as the president said. But it's not just a tragedy, it's an attack.
Now, General Kane says everybody needs to be vigilant, not just the military, because we are witness to what is a new chapter in modern warfare, where civilians are being used as not just the targets,
but the tools of the attack. Ed Dobbins, Keith Whitney, 11 Live News today.
Georgia emergency management officials say there have been reports of price gouging in the state for gas, groceries, and lodging, and the GBI promises to prosecute anyone who inflates prices during this tragedy. Motorists across the country are lining up at gas stations. At one station in Milwaukee, people waited for more than an hour to get to the pump. The image was repeated in Texas, where consumers talked about fear that there would be shortages and price hikes in the day ahead. In Missouri, one station was selling gasoline for $4 a gallon. Most states have laws against price gouging, and attorneys general across the nation are looking into complaints. Meantime, oil prices on overseas markets are on the rise, apparently from fear that the U.S. will strike back in the Middle East. Many metro Atlanta school systems canceled after-school and evening activities Tuesday. In DeKalb County, they stopped all driver's education classes beginning at midday. 11 Live's education editor Donna Lowry visited Georgia State University and talked with students about these attacks.
Oh, I walked into here and I saw all these people clustered around the TVs.
For some Georgia State University students, this is when they first heard about the horrors taking place. They stared at a bank of TV screens in the Student Fitness Center as news of the unthinkable unfolded.
I have a lot of family in Manhattan, and I called my mom, and she said that nobody was in the World Trade Center and everything's okay, and just to calm down.
But calming down for everyone became more difficult with each hour.
It makes you feel scared. You wonder about security measures. How could it have been prevented? And I was thinking, like, how could it have been prevented?
I've always known it was there, because if we pay attention to the news, killings have been going on around the world all the time.
I don't know why I'm so upset about it. It's just so scary, and I just...
Do you think it makes us all feel more vulnerable as a country? I mean,
I want to go hide underground somewhere.
About noon, GSU officials closed the college, sending everyone home and adding to an already growing traffic jam in downtown Atlanta. The shutdown included the GSU Child Development Center. Parents who wanted their children near them at a time like this. Children who fortunately have no idea of what's taking place, such as 6-month-old Carter Swaby, whose mom is a criminal justice professor and not surprised by what's taking place.
Yeah, as a country, we've been lucky so far, and we're finally experiencing what the rest of the world does. We're made to feel so safe and powerful, and I'm very scared.
Donna Lowry, 11 Live News.
Officials have school crisis teams on standby, and they will remain available in coming days. In Clayton County, the head of psychological services sent all principals information on how to help their staffs and students cope with the tragedy. And if you're wondering how to talk with your children who might be frightened by all of this, we put the Clayton County school tips on our website at 11alive.com.
We're going to pause for a moment and check in with Flip Spiceman for a look at our forecast for today.
Quickly, for those of you concerned about the weather today in our area, we expect partly cloudy skies, high temperatures running up into the very low 80s, really a very nice weather pattern for us. As you take a look at your 7-day, mostly sunny skies tomorrow and Friday, too. Less humidity over the next couple of days. The moisture begins to work back in here over the weekend, so thus a few more clouds. But as you can see, cooler temperatures.
All right, Flip, thank you. Family and friends of those missing since yesterday's attacks are left waiting with few answers. People lined up outside of the Bellevue Hospital in New York City last night. A police officer was on hand with an official list of the missing. Thousands of injured were admitted to area hospitals in New York throughout the day. Officials say some of the most seriously injured victims are in desperate need of blood.
Americans are responding to the nationwide plea for blood donors in an overwhelming manner, crowding centers from coast to coast. The American Red Cross alone is sending 50,000 pints of blood to New York. Bonnie Anderson was at one blood donation center here in Atlanta.
They came to offer help, to reach out to fellow citizens in need, to answer a call.
It's times like this to bring out the best in us, and you'll see that. You just see it click around you now, and you can see it in everyone that's here.
This is a time when, that America needs its, citizens to step up and take one for the team, and I think it's my duty to do that.
On an average day, fewer than 10 people walk into the Life South Blood Center in Atlanta to donate. But 1 hour after the first attack on the World Trade Center, the crowds began arriving.
It just tore me apart so much to see what was happening, and I wanted to be there myself to be able to help out, to help the victims, and I couldn't do anything, so the least I could do is get some blood.
By afternoon, at least 200 people were waiting to donate, a wait that lasted more than 3 hours.
Even though it was a long wait, it was better than the wait some people had to get out of the World Trade Center buildings. And we just felt a real need to participate in the community and our country's time of need.
The wait meant nothing at all. This is just incomprehensible.
But all day, they stared at the evidence. To help accommodate the more than 500 donors, the center's bloodmobile also opened its doors. Within 24 hours, the blood will be on its way to victims.
I want to say that Atlanta has some of the best citizens that there are in the country. However, the outpouring around the country has just been incredible.
So, hundreds of miles away from where tragedy struck, citizens in Atlanta and indeed around the nation are reaching out to help, doing what they can, giving of themselves. Bonnie Anderson, CNN, Atlanta.
And for information about local blood donations, call 404-870-4391 or 404-870-4393. 11 Alive is also sponsoring a telethon to help victims. Our live broadcast takes place this Sunday, 11 a.m. here on 11 Alive. Volunteers from the American Red Cross Metropolitan Atlanta chapter will be on hand to take donations, and you can help by tuning in, calling in, and making a donation.
While Americans pull together to help the victims of the attacks, there are people who do not wish us well. Some even found these times for celebration. Yesterday, Palestinians in East Jerusalem were delighted at the bombings and loss of American life. Many Arabs are furious at America for the country's support of Israel. In the streets, they chanted, "God is good." But Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat condemned the attacks in the strongest possible terms, calling them, quote, unbelievable. For many Americans, the anger and rage they feel is directed at one man. Osama bin Laden is the world's best-known Islamic extremist. He's on almost everyone's list of the most likely suspects in yesterday's attacks. Keith Miller has more from London.
Osama bin Laden was last seen publicly this January at his son's wedding in Afghanistan. Rare pictures of a man who reportedly travels only at night, often in disguise, surrounded by bodyguards. He made his reputation in the 1980s, fighting the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan.
He was involved in some horrific battles, which he said later gave him a sort of tranquility and a sense of peace, and it basically made him a pretty fearless guy.
Today, the Central Intelligence Agency calls him the most immediate and serious threat to U.S. security. Bin Laden says the jihad against the United States and killing of Americans is the core of his faith. He was born into a family of wealth, power, and privilege in Saudi Arabia 44 years ago. It was during his days as a student studying economics that he turned to radical Islam. He is linked to a series of global terrorist attacks. February 1993, the bombing of the World Trade Center in New York, 6 dead, more than 1,000 injured. August 7, 1998, the simultaneous U.S. embassy bombings in Kenya and Tanzania, more than 200 killed. And last year, the suicide bomb attack on the USS Cole, resulting in the death of 17 American servicemen.
He alone, probably within the Islamic world, has amassed and developed a terrorist network, an international network, which would be capable of carrying out such an atrocity.
After the embassy bombing, the American government retaliated with missile strikes. The missiles damaged bin Laden's headquarters in Afghanistan, but he escaped unharmed. The U.S. has demanded that the radical Islamic government in Afghanistan hand bin Laden over to American authorities. But the Afghans have refused, despite bin Laden's declaration that all U.S. citizens are legitimate targets.
He's targeted the US because he sees America as the head of the snake, as he calls it. The body of the snake is the corrupt governments in the Middle East that he has promised to overthrow, and also Israel.
Meanwhile, his popularity in the region is reportedly increasing. Recently, an estimated 25,000 followers scattered around the world and prepared to engage in a holy war against America.
And that was Keith Miller reporting. Through mutual reactions of shock, fear, and outrage, the attacks are building a sense of shared pain. It's not the same world of Pearl Harbor days. Today, not only is the news immediate, it often affects us individually through the ties of technology. 11 Live's Joel Thomas shows us how people use that technology to experience yesterday's tragedy.
right after the first plane had hit, they were on the phone with their office there, and she was on the phone with one of the ladies that she regularly contacts, and was talking to her. She said, yeah, they were about to leave the building. They were starting to evacuate now. And she said, oh, my God, that plane's headed straight for us. And they had a television on. Pam said she turned around and looked at the television, and just as the plane began to come in, she heard a scream, the plane hit, and then the phone went dead. So she's, pretty well shook up.
The technology allows us to anguish over an uncertain future. It's going to be important for us to act. I think it's more important for us not to act out. The technology does not guarantee we are safe or can expect people to change.
Security will immediately be heightened at all of our airports, and that some people might consider it to be an inconvenience, but it's going to be an absolute necessity.
But for all the transmitters, gadgets, ease of use, the technology only reminds us we share a common human pain for someone who's missing a loved one.
She had gotten off the subway, this is from her roommate, and saw the two planes hit the towers. And we haven't heard anything about, her whereabouts or well-being yet.
So she would have been right there then when the planes hit?
She would have been right there.
Joel Thomas, 11 Alive News, today.
Now, once people either read the newspaper or saw the news on television, they turned to a higher power to find answers in the tragedy. Here in Atlanta, churches started filling up within hours of the attack. 11 Alive's Jay Watson attended one of the services for the victims.
They asked God for mercy. But in turn, those drawn to church tonight were asked not to respond in anger.
He wants us to react not with violence, not with hatred, not with bitterness, not with thoughts of revenge.
The trickle into churches across Atlanta began this morning. The shock of the attack, too much to absorb.
You have to have faith that there is something out there, that there is a God that watches out, that there are promises made. And this community, not just this congregation, but this community of faith, of believers, is what keeps people going. Without that, the powerlessness would just, I think, overwhelm us.
The very foundation of American life has been rocked.
I think that the world we'll live in, it will never be the same after what has happened today. I think that our sense of security and our sense of confidence in our country has been shaken, and we have a lot of work to do to rebuild that.
For many, the first step towards healing happens here, a place where we can question and call on faith.
At a time like this, I think the only place to turn to is God. It's made the most sense for me to come here.
Jay Watson for 11 Alive News Today.
And a lot more services will be held across the city today. Many of them are scheduled for noon, so those who have to work can attend. Be sure to check with your place of worship for details.
People gathered around the country to remember the victims as well. People gathered in New Hampshire to remember a Massachusetts pilot killed in the tragedy. John Oganowski was flying American Airlines Flight 11 from Boston to Los Angeles. And in Austin, Texas, students at the University of Texas held a candlelight vigil. Students and faculty turned out for the memorial. Students placed candles on the steps of one of the campus buildings and observed a moment of silence.
A lot of comparisons were made between this and Pearl Harbor, but Pearl Harbor was a military target, of course, and for this generation, we saw a very, very vicious attack on civilians, innocent people.
Yeah, and again, what I think of most Americans, the comfort level has been shattered forever, because we felt like in this country, this couldn't happen.
No, even during World War II, we never had this kind of devastation domestically. Yeah. And, the most trouble we had was balloon bombs from Japan, and that caused very little damage and very little loss of life. This is just an unbelievable turn of events.
Well, I think a lot of people never thought they'd live to see the day. I thought my children would never have to go through anything like this. And, I remember my father telling me about Pearl Harbor Day and how he, ran immediately to enlist. I just felt that was an era gone by, and I think a lot of people did.
You bring up an important point. How do you talk to kids about this? How do you make them feel safe about their world?
Boy.
This has come home in the way it has.
The schools are in session today, and I hope that the schools will deal with it, because parents can do so much. And when I talked with my kids, I have 2 teenagers, and we talked yesterday, but I want them to be able to talk with their peers, and I want them to be able to, you know, be in a group session and talk about this. I hope a lot of schools deal with it today. I mean, what event could be more important than what happened yesterday as far as education and learning? And
somehow we have to convey to them that this is still a very strong nation, the only superpower left in the world, and that somehow our leaders will find a way to respond to this, identify those responsible and respond and create a safer world somehow.
And you know, the people who have lived for a while, like you and I, we certainly believe that. Now, yeah, you might have to convince the kids of that right now.
It's going to be a tough task.
But we know that we will prevail, that the country will pull together, and this will, this too shall pass, although never from our memories and from our thoughts. So, our team coverage of America Under Attack continues this morning with local reaction and live reports from New York and Washington.
Stay with us as 11 Alive News and NBC News follow this developing story.
I hope I live. I hope I live. It's coming down on me.
This is so tough with smoke everywhere and people are jumping out the windows. Over there, they're jumping out the windows, I guess, because they're trying to save themselves. I don't know. Move it! Come on! Gotta move back.
Many in shock, some in fear, but most are in disbelief. Terrorism pierces the United States.
September 11, America's doomsday. A trio of airplanes slam into the Pentagon and New York's World Trade Center Twin Towers, and then another crashes in Pennsylvania. The nation froze. Airports closed, and much of the nation stayed glued to their television sets.
This morning, thousands are feared dead, but there's word of survivors, incredibly, in the rubble. Police are sifting through it, and they have found some people alive after all those hours of being buried in all that debris.
Amazing situation. Good morning, I'm Jill Becker.
And I'm Ken Watts. Welcome to this special edition of 11 Alive News today at 5 a.m. The nation remains in utter disbelief almost one day after the greatest attack of terrorism in our nation's history.
Preliminary numbers of casualties are trickling in and are already in the thousands. Hijackers, of course, crashed 4 separate